Welcome everyone to our bi-monthly Global Peoria. This is our opportunity to have local experts weigh in on global news and how it affects us locally. Our host for this event is our illustrious journalist, Shelley Epstein. Take it away, Shelley.
Not terribly illustrious, but
yeah, I agree with that.
It's not even bi-monthly. Since November and December, we're only doing one Thursday, unless you want to gather on Thanksgiving night since we'll all be home, but we can figure that out. So for the first half hour or so, well, for the entire hour, we're going to talk about the election from different perspectives. Normally we talk about international issues, but I suppose the election is an international issue, and so we'll have a little bit of a focus on that. And our first guest is Megan Remmel, who's a poli-sci prof. She's been at Bradley for 5 years. She was fortunate enough to come after I left, so our paths didn't cross. She's a graduate of a PhD from the U of I, and she got her BA from Furman. Megan, where are you from originally?
I'm a military brat, so after my dad got out of the military, we lived in Georgia.
Okay. Yeah. Stacey Abrams' home country.
Yeah.
So I like her initially because her Bradley bio is Spartan, which is a good thing. She doesn't go on to all sorts of things. After she becomes a full professor, I'm sure she'll have all sorts of stuff on there. But basically, her teaching interest is local and state government and the Congress and the presidency, all things that we talk about quite a bit and that I focus on much of my career. So I'm sure we'd have lots to talk about if we had a cup of coffee. And she's going to chat about the perspective of what happened in the election. I understand from my sources that she has been tapped frequently to speak to the media by Bradley administration, because I'm sure none of the other old bulls want to do that anymore. So they'd much rather have her do this anyway. So Megan, I'm going to start it off with a very difficult question.
Yeah.
What the hell happened?
Well, what do you mean what happened? What exactly what's your angle here, Shelley?
I'm the one asking the question, not you. Can you explain what is your take on the election?
Oh, that's a big question.
I'll narrow it from there.
Okay. I have had several kind of, again, I'm from Georgia, so I've had several kind of come to Jesus talks with my students over the last 10 days about the election, about the immediate outcome of the election, yes, but about the last 4 years more broadly, and about, especially with my freshmen who aren't majors and are taking just Intro to American Government to fulfill a degree requirement, trying to impress upon them how vulnerable democracy is, how the vast majority of Americans take it for granted is the most generous term I can come up with, and that just because the AP and the media outlets have called the race for Biden, and just because I think he'll be inaugurated on January 20th, does not mean that fixes the fundamental problems that exist in American democracy right now.
Okay, let me stop you there.
Okay.
What are the fundamental problems with American democracy?
So Angela knows this about me, in that I have a side hobby of African politics. And if I could do grad school over again and learn French, I would have done African politics. And when I teach sub-Saharan African politics, students are oftentimes surprised at how similar the United States is to a lot of sub-Saharan African countries. They are surprised that by the end of the semester, I think they're often surprised that the United States hasn't had more turmoil than it's had. We have a lot of the factors that would predispose a country to repeated civil wars, to repeated coup attempts, to repeated assassination attempts, to civil uprisings. We have a lot of the ingredients for that, and have managed to skate by in a combination of historical circumstance and sheer dumb luck. And I think that a lot of those ingredients are getting more pronounced recently. Now, that's not to say that the United States was like this perfect democracy earlier in time. In fact, there's debate in political science about at what point you could actually call the United States a democracy. If you don't have universal adult suffrage, it's hard to call it a democracy. So that means that we weren't a democracy until at least 1920. And then with Jim Crow era laws, maybe not even until the 1960s. And then if you start to bring in felon disenfranchisement and voter ID laws and ballot access issues, there's debate about how democratic the United States has ever actually been. But
it's very democratic if you're a rich white guy.
Well, yeah, then it's not democratic. So
who cares about those other people?
Yeah, who cares about the rest of us? So I think that a lot of the understanding in the United States about how democratic we are is very shallow, it's very superficial, and it's very hollow. And so I bring up the African example because a lot of these countries that got independence in the 60s and 70s, there tends to be this sort of evolution to democracy where you get better at it over time, but things can be unstable for decades. And so in a lot of these African countries where, to B. Drake's, to Barb's question, there is substantial income inequality, there is substantial racial and ethnic and religious diversity, where there is federalism. Federalism is not an ingredient for politics. I don't think most political scientists, if you ask them to design a country, would pick a presidential system or a federalist system. So those are the sort of factors that actually seem to predispose countries to instability, especially in democratic terms. So in a lot of these African countries that were sort of thrust into being democracies with very little runway to work off of, the understanding of democracy is very zero sum. It's I win, you lose. And if you win, I'm screwed. And while you're in government, because you're not sure how long you're going to be in power, because of an election, because of a coup, because of secessionist movements, you take advantage of being in power while you have the opportunity to, and you kind of exploit the riches of it, and you try to make it very difficult for the other side to get back into power to try to prolong how long you have control.
So, that has been crystal clear in the last 20 years, especially with the sophistication of gerrymandering, which is obviously a term that goes back many years, and so it existed. But it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that back in the day, I'm an old guy, so back in the good old days, it wasn't a zero-sum game. And the Republicans and the Democrats worked together, and they passed legislation. There was it wasn't, if you pass legislation, Mr. Democratic President, and I'm a Republican, I lose, you win, and so I don't want to do that. But that's how it's been for the last 12 years, certainly.
There's been a change in culture, and to your point, the parties, up until the 1960s, the parties were very internally diverse. So you had liberal Republicans, you had conservative Democrats, they were from all over the country. And so ideology and party identification didn't cleanly match up. And starting in the 1950s, but definitely in the 1960s and by the 1970s, there is this polarization movement where, in particular, Southern Democrats realize that the Democratic Party is no longer an ideological fit for them, and so they leave and join the Republicans. That then starts to change the composition of the Republican Party, and those liberal Republicans jump ship from the Republican Party and join the Democrats. And so you get two political parties that are much more internally homogenous. So inside the parties, they're ideologically much more similar. And as a result, that means there's very little overlap between the two political parties now. From a voter perspective, that's actually, there are benefits to polarization. It makes it easier to use an R or a D behind a candidate's name when you're voting, because you actually know that if you see a Republican candidate, they're probably anti-abortion. They're probably for limited government regulation of the economy. Whereas in the 50s or 60s, that letter behind a candidate's name didn't give you a ton of information. And so now that cue is much stronger to voters, and most voters don't put any more effort into voting than just looking at the candidate's party affiliation. So that makes it easier. Plus, it makes it easier to hold the parties accountable because you know which party's responsible for political policies that are being put in place because they're so divided.
It also, certainly, the leadership of the party, and maybe this is just unique to our current situation, seems to have exponentially more control over the minions than before.
So that's actually yes and no. Political science research in American politics in particular shows that the parties really started to polarize in the 60s and 70s. But most of the polarization we've seen in the United States over the last 50 years is the responsibility of the Republican Party. And that is partly, if not, I think one of the most influential and consequential political leaders of the last 100 years that people don't seem to acknowledge is Newt Gingrich. In the 70s, when he was first elected into Congress, he very much decided as an individual that he was done playing by some of these kind of rules where, to your point, committee chairs were more powerful than the party leadership was. And so over the course of 15 to 20 years, he built this kind of corollary to the Republican Party with things like the Christian Coalition and the American Conservative Union and some of these other kind of they're not technically Republican Party, but they're affiliated with, very much created this apparatus that would recruit candidates who were of the Newt Gingrich ilk, not just in terms of their ideology and their policy positions, but in terms of the way that they were going to behave once they were in office and how they were going to work or not work with the opposition. And so that culminates, and most of you appear to have been old enough like me to be alive in 1994 with the Republican Revolution and the contract with America and the Republicans taking control of the House of Representatives for the first time in 50 years. So that does lead to the party leadership having more power. However, American political parties are also very, very weak comparatively to the rest of the world. We don't have that same kind of party cohesion. Now, don't get me wrong, we still have party unity votes of 90 to 92%, but in a parliamentary system, especially with a party list system where the party gets to decide who's going to be in parliament, you have almost close to 100% party cohesion. And so the problem is that the political parties in particular don't have control over who runs under their labels. So the Republican Party in 2016, regardless of what your personal preferences are, does not want Donald Trump to be its nominee. It doesn't sell well for them. It ends up working out, but that was a hugely risky maneuver for them. And they would have preferred a much more mainstream Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio. And so in some ways, the parties have control over their elected co-partisans in areas of government once they're in office, but they have very little control over who's getting elected. So when we see some of these Senate or these House seats in particular, where the candidates have QAnon tendencies, I don't know what other word to use, that is a sign that the party's not in great control over who they are recruiting to join the party. And they don't have that capacity in the United States. So what's actually, there's a political science professor at Marquette named Julia Azari, and she's actually working on a book right now that's called Weak Parties, Strong Partisanship. And so in the United States, we have very, very strong partisan identities, but the political parties actually don't have a ton of control over who joins the party and how the party actually operates. And this is another federalism quirk where we've got the Georgia Democratic Party getting Marjorie Greene, another QAnon person, and that's not what the Republican Party nationally wants, but the Republican Party nationally can't stop the Georgia GOP from doing that.
They've had Steve King for a while from Iowa, and so he's
and
not a QAnon, but he's a nutball.
No, but he's an ardent nationalist, and I think the GOP is happy to get rid of him.
Right, conservatives will say some of the people on the left, whether it's AOC or others, they're out of the mainstream too. But let me ask this question, and I apologize for those who tuned in to hear about the 2020 election. We've gotten a little bit off course, but I'm interested in this, and get your own show if you want to talk about something else. In discussing the political parties, it is my belief, and I want you to correct me, Professor, that both parties are at a very interesting tipping point here, and I think there may be blood in the water. In that, The Republicans have the Trumpies, who are a real element, whatever they believe, it's hard to know, but they believe in Trump, and they're very, with Tea Party, they're right, and there is still some mainstream Republicanism, although they've been subjugated. And there's going to have to be a reckoning between which one of those controls the party. For the Democrats, you've got the progressives, who took a backseat this time, to the more moderates, but that's not going to last forever. And, you know, Biden clearly is probably a one-term guy, and there's going to be that going on in the Democratic Party. So they're going to have some internal issues as well. With that long, you can tell I babble on for a while. Is it possible for there to be a realignment, if not a third party movement? Do you see the stars aligning for that at all?
I see the stars aligning for a realignment. I don't see the stars aligning for a third party movement. To your point about realignment, we've had, generally, political historians will say that there's been 6 party systems in the United States. And the last real realignment we had was in 1968, when it really became clear that the Democrats were the party of Black Americans and unions, and really solidified around that. And the Republican identity started to become much whiter and much more rural and much more conservative. Generally, across the course of American history, we've generally had realignments every 40 to 50 years. And so that would mean that we are well overdue for a realignment. So if you think about it as kind of like, you know, Yellowstone's caldera, we're due for an eruption. But to your point, it's not going to be that we get a third party necessarily, because that's not how the American system is designed, because of ballot access laws, because of single member districts, because of plurality voting rules. We've made it very difficult for third parties to have a chance to get a foothold in. So what would happen, yes, is a changing of who identifies as a Republican or who identifies as a Democrat. But I don't know, I don't think it's gonna be as quick a process as it's been in the past, where we have like this identifiable election that's the turning point. So in 2020, for instance, we've seen, at least from the exit polls I've seen so far, the Hispanic vote being more Trump than I think people were predicting. And so it's not quite working out the way that I think people think it would for a clean realignment. So I don't think you could say that 2016 was the realigning election. I don't think you can cleanly say that 2020 is going to be the realigning election.
It's incremental, but it's the Hispanic vote, I think, is still 70-30 or 60-40. It's still...
Yeah, but Trump, even in light of the rhetoric of his administration for the last 4 years, made footholds, and not just within the kind of Venezuelan, Cuban, Colombian communities.
Right.
So that's why I'm saying is that I don't think it's going to be as readily identifiable to have a particular realignment. Now, I do think the Republicans have an easier time because internally, again, they are not nearly as mixed up in terms of the ideological perspective. So I think there's plenty of never Trumpers that you mentioned who don't dislike necessarily the policies coming out of the Trump administration, but don't like the character or the personality that's representing them. So like a Rick Wilson, for instance, is very much a Project Lincoln never Trumper, but is also incredibly, incredibly conservative. So I think what they need to figure out is how they're going to kind of wrap themselves in public relations. But the Democrats, I think, have a much more core issue, as you pointed out, about where the party's direction is going to go. I do think, if I had to make a prediction, that slowly but surely the progressive wing will win simply because older voters get replaced. We call it generational replacement. It's a nice way of saying what you think it is. And so the younger voters are definitely much more progressive. But that is also going to be a multi-decade process that then puts the Democrats behind in campaigns because the Republicans are going to have it more together. Furthermore, I think the Republicans are, and this is of the last 40 or 50 years, the Republicans are much more likely to see politics as a game to be played. Democrats are much more concerned about, at least historically, much more concerned about building bridges and consensus. So like Joe Manchin in West Virginia, refusing to say that even if they had a Democratic control of the Senate, he's not going to be on board with court expansion, for instance, because he wants to keep it to be a bipartisan institution. Whereas an AOC sort of wing, the squad, are much more of the Republican ilk in terms of playing the game. So I do think the Democrats actually have a tougher time right now because of how mixed up they are versus the Republicans.
I think there's bad stuff on both sides. There's game playing. But that aside, so if the Dems go to the left and the Republicans go to the right, which is basically, even though Trumpism is not to the right, I mean, there is some traditionally unconservative philosophies that Trump has embraced and his followers have gone. Where does that go for the great middle, where, the country, that's what I see, that's what I fear will happen, that each party will go to their corners.
Can I try to pull the fairy tale away? There are a huge, probably a third to 40% of American voters identify as independent or moderate.
They're all lying.
They're lying. They're delusional. I think they want to feel like they are independent. I think they want to feel like they are capable of voting both ways, but actually that group of voters who identifies as independent is much more likely to vote reliably with one of the two major political parties than someone who actually identifies with one of the two major political parties. So they actually function even more partisan than people who actually identify as partisans. So I'm not sure that there is that much of a great middle. Now, is there 8% of the population that actually falls in that realm? Probably. But I don't think there is this actual hidden middle where a consensus is to be found and where people actually have in between political views. What I do think is that Americans have very little ideological coherence. And they are much more attached to their party identification than to the ideology behind that party identification. So I think most political science would say that party identification has become the equivalent of a social identity. It's the equivalent of identifying as male or female. It's the equivalent of identifying as a person of color. It's the equivalent of identifying as queer. And that party identification does not necessarily have an ideological foundation to it. And to your point, that's what Trumpism is that it is all about identity and very little substance underneath it in terms of
no policy, right? And so the question
represents.
is, post-Trump, do we continue on that road, or do we go back to a more sane division, a more policy-focused division?
I'm not sure that we had that much of a policy-focused division even under Obama or even under Bush. I think because things have been so crazy under the Trump administration, which I will not say in class, but I will say this to you all, because things have been so insane for the last 4 years. I mean, I am exhausted. I just want I regret my job choice every day right now. Because it is so exhausting, I think we get these rose-colored glasses about the Obama administration, about the Bush administration, even about Clinton, because it just seemed normal. But obviously we had huge government shutdowns during the Clinton administration. Clinton, for all intents and purposes, got bossed around pretty seriously by Newt Gingrich and by the Republican Party in the House. And a lot of his party and policy initiatives just get torpedoed or very, very watered down.
Until he beat Newt at the shutdown and cowed him.
Yeah, but Newt ends up getting what he wants anyway with a balanced budget. So yeah, maybe he loses the PR battle, but he gets a lot of the policy out of it that he wants. I don't think that there is a good old time to go back to.
Right. So, Don asked this, and this was a question I explored last night with a politics watcher who I'm related to. And the question is this. So the Senate winds up being 52-48, let's say, because the Democrats win one of the Georgia seats. That would be kind of an upset, but possible. Either way, stay with me for a moment. The Republicans hold the Senate. Our new president has sold himself as a guy that can reach across the aisle. He's a product of the Senate. He's done it for 40 years. He knows those guys and drinks with them. And so he is a throwback. And yet, for the last 12 years, the party, both parties, but primarily the Republic, have really been in lockstep to their leaders and have not crossed the aisle on anything significant other than John McCain. So the question is, what do you see for the next 2 years before the Democrats get their asses wiped in 2022? Can Biden pick off some moderate, or some, I won't even say moderate, some reasonable Republicans to get some of his more moderate policies through?
Maybe. I don't have high hopes because Mitch McConnell is brilliant. He is incredibly good at his job. He has wanted to be Senate Majority Leader since he was like an infant, and he has been preparing for it his entire life, and he is excellent at it. And he's very, very good at keeping his membership in line. Now, Biden obviously does have a relationship with some of these Republican senators.
All you need is a couple.
Well, yeah, he needs to peel off 2 of them. But I do think that even some of the senators who might have been amenable to working with him, like a Susan Collins, she just won her reelection, not only resoundingly, but by being a Trump supporter? Question mark. So I think she's, and others like her, have received a message that if they want to stay in office, then they need to stay in the Trump lane. So I think even some of the people who would have been sort of easy pickings for Biden to try to peel off are going to be hard to sway. Now, Elisa Murkowski is just always wants to do what she wants to do. And I would love to be a fly on the wall in a conversation between Lisa Murkowski and Mitch McConnell, because I really feel like she just doesn't put up with anything he tells her to do. But between the Tom Tillis getting reelected, Tom Tillis back in 2016 openly said that if Hillary Clinton had won the election, that they were going to keep that Supreme Court seat open for 4 years. So that's not anybody that he's going to be able to work with. Josh Hawley over in Missouri is definitely gearing up to run for president at some point, as is maybe Tom Cotton in Arkansas. So no, I don't think Biden accomplishes much of anything. If anything, it's kind of a stopgap measure of just at least ending the Trump administration, but I don't see Biden getting to accomplish much at all, especially because the Democrats are internally divided in the House, and the Democrats just lost seats. So yes, to your point, generally the president's party loses seats in the midterm elections. So I think at that point you have to be more careful about protecting the House and at least keeping one of the chambers in Democratic hands than in terms of being able to focus on getting anything done through the Senate.
So one thing that I think we're gonna broaden this out. So your contention that the Dems are moving left and the progressives, because people are young, the only problem with young progressives is they become older and then less progressive. And we'll see if this generation does that. But in the 2018 midterm election, most of the gains that the Democrats made were in moderate suburban districts, mostly women. That was a far greater cohort than the progressives, the AOC, the Squad folks, who had some obviously gains as well. And after this last election, as I'm sure you know, Sherry Bustos, who's your congresswoman from Bradley and the Quad Cities, she got her butt kicked in an internal caucus, and the moderates said to the progressives, I don't want to hear you say socialism or anything like that for the next 2 years, because that's how we're going to get killed. And so I'm curious, why you think the progressive wing is moving when clearly the strength, the seat gains were much more in the moderate realm.
I think you and I are talking in different time frames. I'm talking 20 plus years of this happening. I'm not talking within the next 2 to 5 election cycles. I just don't see the progressive wing, not this generation, being willing to, one, there's now a rehashing of evidence about whether or not people actually get more conservative as they get older. That's less of an agreed upon.
I would agree.
Political science research.
Some get more liberal.
Ask my parents. The Trump administration has turned them into radicals. My military parents have just gone off the left deep end, and it's bizarre to watch. But I don't. I think for sure, this is, again, one of the problems of the Democratic Party in being internally divided, is that I think the party tries to have a unified message, and there's reasons for that. It's easier for marketing, it's easier for ad campaigns, it's easier for using data to target voters, to not have to build multiple statistical models. So I think the problem with the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, is that they do try to take a one-size-fits-all approach, and that's not going to work. Especially with this internal division. They're going to have to recognize that AOC's district is fine with her calling herself a democratic socialist. And if Sherry Bustos does that, she's losing her seat in 2022.
Correct.
So I think there needs to be more recognition within the Democratic Party that there's going to have to be substantial variations in what the campaigns look like, but that also means that they need to have a better ground game. Republicans are better at the ground game. Republicans are better at staying in communities between election cycles to keep their finger on the pulse and to have some idea of what direction the community's moving in so that they can target their ad campaigns. Democrats tend to be very election focused, and then they just disappear in between election cycles. And so they don't actually see the movement of a community, at least the Democratic Party as an apparatus is not necessarily seeing the movements within the communities. And so their campaigning needs to be much more targeted in the way that the Republicans are. Like a Marjorie Taylor Greene, that QAnon woman I keep mentioning in Georgia, and I say this because I'm from Georgia and she would have been my congresswoman.
We won't trust you anymore.
She can make that work in her district, but an Adam Kinzinger district would never be able to fly. And the Republicans are much better at tailoring their candidates to fit the particular districts. So I get where you're coming from in that there is going to be this divide in the party. To your point, I think gerrymandering is going to help take care of more of these borderline districts. After Illinois loses its inevitable seat in Congress next year, obviously we're going to be down to, 17 congressional districts at that point? And
Yep.
Darren LaHood's district is going to be just glow in the dark red. It's just going to just beacon in the night red. If it wasn't already, it's going to be just insanely red in an effort to try to peel off as many of those Republicans out of Sherry Bustos's district, or as many of those those Republicans out of Rodney Davis's district over in Champaign. So I don't think that there's going to be that many of these moderate districts left.
Okay, so Alan asked this question, and then we're going to go to our international students. Alan obviously is smarter than me because he read a Brookings report published this week.
Oh, I have not seen this, though. This will be new to me.
So let me read this to you. It says 477 counties which supported Biden account for 70% of the economic activity. Right, and I did read this. And 2,500 so counties that supported Trump accounted for 30% of the economic activity. So in fact, the Democrat counties, of which there are far less, but they accounted for twice as much of the economic activity. So his question is, aren't we seeing a division in the U.S. driven by the economic divide? And doesn't this economic gap leave the door open for a populist like Trump who promises anything to people who feel they're economically left behind?
I don't know if I just immediately attribute it to economics, in that the American system is not democratic. If it were, we wouldn't have the Electoral College. We wouldn't have the Senate. So I think part of that is that there's going to be a population. These districts are also going to have high levels of population, concentrated populations, and probably access to, in a lot of cases, ports, which I know sounds dumb to say in 2020, but obviously given the amount of just global shipping there is, having coast is super important. And so I don't know, yes, economics comes along with it, but I think the immediate issue is the distribution of population across the United States versus how we actually allocate representation in our government. And the fact that we allocate based off of territory and land size more than anything else rather than population, and that population is super concentrated, and where the population is concentrated, you're going to have more economic activity. So I get that the economic divide, like I mentioned at the beginning with African countries, one of the big problems is huge amounts of income inequality, like even worse than the United States. And that does not foster good relationships. And so, yes, it does make some populist leaning candidates more attractive. So in some, again, back in some of these African countries, there's a youth bulge in the population distribution, and there's just huge percentages of the population are below 18. And so they weren't alive during colonialism. And so they don't have this like comparison point of being like, oh, actually it was way worse when the Belgians were here. Like, y'all don't know how much better it is now. They don't have that comparison point. And so there is some sympathy towards these strong men that come in because they promise these guarantees that the older generations are like, they can't follow up on that. So yes, I do think this income inequality opens the door, but I think it just stems, yes, income inequality is for sure a systemic issue in the United States, but in terms of the balance of power and the fact that a majority of Americans support generally liberal policy positions in terms of abortion, in terms of gun control, in terms of a national healthcare system. But because of how we allocate power in the United States, and it's not based on population, and it's certainly not one person, one vote, that is a more fundamental issue that would, I think, if that were addressed in multiple ways, would then have the long stream consequence of improving some of this economic inequality, for instance. But I don't think fixing economic inequality fixes these larger systemic issues that continue to promulgate economic inequality.
Okay. Megan, stand by. Group, we are now going to hear from a couple of Bradley students, international students, because I don't know about you, but I am fascinated to know what folks around the world think about what's going on in our great country. And so we're going to start off with Nastia, correct?
Yep.
Nastia, okay, you'll have to pronounce your last name for me, Nastia.
Oh, don't try it.
Okay, so Nastia is a graduate student in biochemistry. So she's already out of my league. Her hometown is St. Petersburg, which Angela introduced me to a couple of years ago, and is a lovely town. It is also the hometown of Vladimir Putin, so obviously she must know him from seeing him at the coffee shop. But
oh, I did, yeah. For sure.
My question, hopefully you've talked to the folks back home. What do they think about our election cycle and the outcome?
Okay, so I've been talking to my parents about just like this whole election, and I was like asking them like what's happening back home and like how like people react on it and like what people think about it. And I asked my mom, and I was like, hey, like, can you tell me like what news tell about this whole election? So right now, 99% of Russian news is all about election. Like nothing else is happening in the world, only election. So that's like a really big deal for Russia, and like I get why. I mean, like America and Russia, two biggest countries, and obviously like the connection between these two countries is really important. And yeah, so like election is like really like well discussed back home. And actually, for my surprise, a lot of people in Russia were really like disappointed when they knew that Biden is kind of like winning the election. A lot of people in Russia support Trump. And from like what I heard is that like, I don't know if it's true or not, but like Putin has some like connections with Trump, and like that's why like everyone wanted Trump to win, and they thought that like that's gonna help Russian economy like with like currency and everything. So like we used to have Russian ruble used to be like, let's say you want to buy $1, you will spend like 30 rubles. Right now, if you want to buy $1, that's like 80 rubles. So it's like crazy what happened. And everyone was thinking that if, let's say, Trump stays president, that's gonna help like the whole situation, and like the ruble is gonna go up, and that's gonna help the whole like economy. So, but now Biden is winning, so like that's what's gonna like influence the whole economy back home.
So there's
But like,
been a
what
lot
can I
of
say
this.
about like election? Yeah,
Pardon?
go ahead.
I was going to say there's been a lot of discussion in the press.
Oh, there's
Uh,
a lot of discussion. Like everyone is talking about it.
Right, but in the U.S., that's interesting. In the U.S. press, there's discussion that this post-election period where Trump hasn't conceded and there's a question about the transition. There was a great story in the New York Times about other authoritarian countries, Zimbabwe, Megan. If you haven't read that story, you should read it if you're an African. And then where the authoritarian leader hasn't given up. And frankly, the question is whether this diminishes our standing as a great democracy in the world. I guess I'm wondering, do you think that Russians will look at this, what's going on in the US, and say, see, they're as bad as we are. What's the big deal?
That's a good question. You know, like always, like we have this like perception that like America is way better than Russia, like in everything. Like that's like everyone thinks that way back home. They're like, oh, like America does that, so like we need to do that too. But like, what's the biggest difference is that like in Russia, I'm gonna admit that Russia is really corrupted. Like everyone knows that. And like for now, like we have Putin who's president, and he changed the rules so that now he can be president for as long as he wants to. So before it used to be that you're president for like, let's say 4 years, then you get reelected, so you become president for another 4 years, and that's about it. You cannot be president more than that. But now he changed the rules, so now he can be president for as long as he wants to. So
And do Russians think that's a good idea?
No, so that's the thing. We had election, and there was that was the only question in the election. Do you want this rule to apply for the country? And my parents went to elect, and they said, no, we don't want that. Like, we think that it's gonna be better if we have like a new person as a president with like new like views and everything. And in Russia, the way how you vote, you have like a paper where you like put your answer, and then you put it in a box, in a glass box. So technically you can see what other people vote. And from what my parents saw, almost everyone said no, almost everyone. And that's when then we talked to like our friends, our relatives. Almost everyone said no. And guess what? At the end, it turns out that people voted for yes, and that's how it is right now. Like he can be president for like as long as he wants to.
Nastia, I grew up in Chicago, so I understand that type of voting system.
Yeah, that's pretty corrupted.
So let me ask one more question about Russia, and maybe I'll pose this to Angela. Many world leaders have called President Biden, President-elect Biden, and congratulated him or recognized him. Today, the Pope did, which was a big deal because Joe is our second Roman Catholic. Why hasn't Putin reached out in the same way so many others have? Angela? You have to unmute. Get with the program here.
I was going to let Nastia answer first. Do you have a speculation of why he hasn't congratulated Biden yet?
Oh, because he wanted Trump to win.
Yeah, I think that's the obvious answer, is he wanted Trump to win. And so until it's absolutely positively Biden, he's not going to congratulate him. I think there's a little more to it. And I think it goes back to what you were talking about earlier, Nastia. This is a way to demonstrate that the United States is a mess. And Russia's been saying it for a long time. Putin's been saying it for a long time. And so to let the United States, trudge around in its own muck for a while is just fine for Putin. So if he congratulates Biden, then he's helping end this mess. And I think it works in his favor, both because he wanted Trump and because it makes the United States look bad. So.
Yeah, I'd say it's the reason why the Russians meddled in 2016, because they want to undermine democracy and make it look bad. And if we look bad, if we're in the muck, then other countries are less likely to come into our sphere. And if they don't come to our sphere because we're a mess, it makes it easier for the Russian sphere to expand, as they've done in other parts of the world. Okay, sit tight, Nastia. We'll come back to you. Our other guest is
Sushruth.
Sushruth. How do I pronounce your name?
Hi, yeah, it's Sushruth.
Okay, and what country are you from? And what? Pardon?
I'm from India.
India, and what is your major?
My major is in construction management.
I feel like this is our first date. Okay, so my question for you is this. There you are. Have you been talking to the folks back home? And I mean, India is a democracy like we are. Theoretically, I'm not sure that Megan would agree with that, but we'll go with that for a while. What are they saying about what happened in the last election cycle, and particularly the election?
Honestly, I'm not sorry and stuff like that, but I've been talking to a couple of friends back home, and to be honest, they're all glad that Biden won. I mean, mainly because a lot of Indians are planning to come migrate to US for better opportunities in studies and jobs and like that. And with past rules and regulations by Trump, not many are happy with it. So I'm pretty sure that they've been waiting for a change in presidency here in USA.
But what do they speak to the process at all? Are they familiar with, you know, the negative ads, the mudslinging, the lies, the this and that? Do they speak to that?
No. I haven't got that deep into conversation with any of my friends regarding that. But
well,
I think
how long have you been in the US?
It's been less than a year.
Okay, so perfect. So what do you observed this first American election? What do you make of this?
I don't know. I think it did really take long. That's the first opinion. And coming to, you know, these lies and you know, how can I say this? Rigging of elections, I don't know, is that the right word? But
Yes.
It happens everywhere in the world. In India, it happens a lot too. So I can say that I got used to this kind of elections where you don't, you want someone else to win, but someone else end up winning because they're already in the power and stuff like that. But this time, I think something different happened. Something good happened, I guess.
You know, if your elections are as nasty as ours, as you're suggesting, that's very depressing, because, you know, many of us were thinking about leaving the country if Trump won to go a more sane place. And if there's not a more sane place, that's okay. So when you were home in India, and Donald Trump was president, what was the impression? Did they think he was a good guy, a bad guy, good for India, bad for India?
In simple terms, bad for India. That's what a lot of people in general thought. But the political part of India, they were very much in coordination with Trump. You know about, I'm not sure if you guys know the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi. Yeah.
He's a pretty conservative guy.
Yeah, so he has been in good relationship with Trump, and he said that with his relationship, there's a lot of better thing that can happen between India and American relationship, and with the economy and stuff like that. But in general, people's opinion was Trump wasn't right even for India. Like if it affects in any way, yeah.
Even though Modi was his buddy. You know, one thing Nastia said, which was fascinating, I thought, that one of the reasons the Russian people liked Trump is because he was good for their economy. And so
Yeah.
everybody kind of looks through things like through their own lens. Was Trump good for the Indian economy?
I would say yes. Yeah, that's what I've been hearing, I've been seeing. I think he's good for the Indian economy, but let's see, maybe Biden could be better.
Well, we could always hope he'll be saner, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Remember, we're a non-partisan organization. We're a big tent, Shelley. Remember that.
Oh, that's right. That's right. I forgot about that. This is like Fox News. I get to do my own thing. So I've got a question from Megan, I think. Let me read this. It's from Don. It says, Putin is winning his own disinformation campaign in the U.S. elections, making them appear corrupt, even though there has been no substantial evidence. Has this, what is your take on whether this election has been fair, free of fraud, upstanding, or like all the others we've had?
I mean, from everything I've seen, it seems to be completely above board. Now, are there always going to be random, sporadic clerical errors and people? My students love you all dearly, but they don't understand sometimes just basics. So like I had students who didn't realize how to like buy a stamp to request an absentee ballot. And so they will accidentally get an absentee ballot, but then they'll go vote in person and need to cast a provisional ballot. Like most of the problems that happen in American elections, all this is to say is that it's human error, not intentional fraud.
This is why landowners should be the only ones who vote.
So I'm just going to gloss right over that one. In the Trump administration, or the Trump campaign, I should say, separate from the administration, the Trump campaign is obviously filing lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit, and they keep getting tossed out. The ones that they're getting a little traction on is actually having poll watchers be closer to the actual counting, but all of the stuff about the fraud is all being chucked out for hearsay and double hearsay and even triple hearsay. But I don't think at this point that the GOP actually thinks any of this is going to be successful. I don't think that they think they're going to overturn the election. I don't think they thought that last Tuesday. What I think they're doing is a giant media and PR strategy to undermine the legitimacy of the Biden presidency, especially if they manage to keep control of the Senate, which is likely. I say this as a Georgian who doesn't want that to be the case, but it's probably likely that they win at least one of those Senate seats and keep control of the Senate 51-49, if not 52-48. And so that gives those 52 or 51 Republican senators the ability to continue to call into question the legitimacy of a Biden presidency and to not cooperate with the Biden presidency because it is somehow illegitimate. So I think that's the Republicans' long game here, is to highlight or try to make it seem like there is an uncertainty in the American system that isn't actually there. And yes, to Donald's point, yeah, for sure. It doesn't even have to be coming from Putin. It doesn't have to be coming from some non-American actor. It benefits them regardless. So I don't think Putin, I'm sure he'd be a fan of the Republicans keeping control of the Senate just because it continues to keep the American system in turmoil.
Well, you could make an argument that once upon a time there was value in divided government, so that one side doesn't go off the rails. But if it's going to be, if divided government means stymied government and no government action, which mostly we had, then that's not such a good thing. So political scientists and historians like to look in the rearview mirror and tell us what happened. But I want journalists to do that too sometimes. But I want to know what the next 7 weeks are going to be like. How do you see this playing out? And do you see Republicans pressuring Trump effectively to either concede or open up the transition or show up for the inauguration How do you see that all playing out?
Well, to be sure, I don't think we're going to have an inauguration that looks like any inauguration in the past. So I think it's going to be really easy for Republicans to not participate and for the Biden administration to not invite Republicans, because I think it's basically going to be a private ceremony with Chief Justice John Roberts, Jill Biden, Joe, and maybe some grandkids. I don't think it's going to be a big typical inauguration.
And not Donald Trump.
No, but I think you can couch that in it's COVID-19 and we're trying to limit the number of people who are around the president-elect. I don't think you even have to make it political that way.
He'd have to wear a mask.
Political science is probabilistic. So to your point, we use data from the past to try to predict in the future. And a lot of the models, a lot of statistical models, so polling, for instance, not doing so well under this current environment, not because the models are bad per se, but because the environment has changed so radically in such a seemingly short period of time that they haven't been able to adjust for it. So I do not feel confident in my predictions on anything right now. I don't anticipate a coup. I would like to see the coup talk calm down in the media right now. Because there are multiple types of coups. They all require in some way, shape, or form the military to at least acquiesce and to not get in the way, if not have active military participation. And in the American military, the American military is incredibly professionalized. These are people who go through months, if not years of training in various schools like Airborne and Ranger and all that kind of stuff. So it's incredibly professionalized. But two, the officer corps doesn't generally support Trump. Again, that's not to say they're not conservative, but they are generally hesitant to have Trump in a leadership position. And so I don't think there's support in the officer ranks. And then in the enlisted ranks of the military in the United States are relatively diverse, especially in terms of racial and ethnic diversity. And so I don't think there's a codified mass that would then support a Trump administration. So do I think there's going to be a coup? Do I think that Trump's going to, there's a phenomenon called a self-coup, where you basically suspend all of democracy once you've been elected so that you can stay in power longer? I don't see that happening. So do I think Trump leaves office on January 20th, 2021? Yeah. Do I think it's going to be a bumpy ride towards then? Yeah. Do I think the Biden administration gets all of the courtesies that a previous administration would have gotten in terms of transitioning, in terms of like access to the presidential daily briefing, or even office space that the General Services Administration is currently not allowing the Biden transition team to have access to? It's going to be bumpy. I don't think it's going to be that clean transition that you typically get January 20th at noon, where it's just kind of like a seamless, smooth transition. I don't think we're going to get that, but I do think we are going to have a transition to a new president.
So you think it's unlikely we could burn his bald head at a stake?
I would like
Okay.
Okay, I'm just going to leave that.
Because we're nonpartisan here at PAWAC. So
That's right.
Okay, it is 8 o'clock, girls and boys. And this could go on for hours. Before we leave, I'll make one pitch. Next Thursday, Ali and PAWAC and others are sponsoring another discussion. Megan, I would particularly invite you to come at 6:30 Central Time. A reporter who covered the election and also the last couple elections for the New York Times by the name of Reed Epstein. He's going to be talking about his experience on the campaign trail, which was mostly from his bedroom. But it'll be interesting to hear what he has to say, and I invite you all to come and hear Peoria's own, have some discussion. Angela, what else do we need to say?
Well, I'd like to thank our graduate student guests, Nastia and Sushruth. Thank you guys so much for offering your points of view from Russia and India. And
I'd love you guys to come back.
Definitely.
You guys were great.
Oh, thank you for inviting.
Yeah, but we do weird stuff like this all the time in the World Affairs Council. So we have some pretty lively discussions, we'll say. So, and I would like to thank Dr. Remmel for joining us as well. I think we learned a lot, as well as had some good smackdown discussions. So thank you for the education as well as the commentary. And with that, tomorrow, remember, we have Giles Trendle, who is joining us from Al Jazeera English. He is the managing director of Al Jazeera English, 11 a.m. tomorrow if you are interested. And for Megan and Nastia and that, I'm going to stumble on your name, Sushruth. I will send you guys the link so you can be our guests if you are free at 11 a.m. and you want to hear about Al Jazeera. And then, as Shelley pointed out, next week, Reed Epstein on the 19th. Next week is also the World Affairs Councils of America annual conference. It's all virtual this year. If you want to attend, please sign up for that. And we've got some fun stuff coming up with a quiz bowl a little later over Thanksgiving break. And with that, I'll tell everyone good night. If you're not a member yet, please become a member. Peoria Area World Affairs Council. Good night, everyone.